My name is Trevor Cano, and I'm the Director of Special Events and NYU Alumni Relations. On behalf of our NYU alumni team, I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, Engaging Art, Lynn Gumpert in Conversation with Roslyn Bernstein, presented by the NYU Alumni Association and the Gray Art Gallery. Now, before we begin, please know that all of us at NYU hope you and your families are safe and well in these unprecedented times. We have moved our programming online and are thankful you have chosen to join us and continue learning from the collective knowledge of our NYU community. The NYU Alumni Association represents over 500,000 alumni all over the world. On average, we host nearly 700 events annually to connect you with your NYU alumni community. Make sure to check the NYU Alumni website and social media platforms to keep up to date with all our events and programs. If you have questions during tonight's program, please enter them in the question and answer box on your Zoom screen. We will get to as many questions as we can by the end of the program. Thank you again for joining us. Now I'm delighted to invite tonight's moderator, Lynn Gumpert, Director of the Gray Art Gallery, to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Roslyn Bernstein. Lynn and Roz, please turn on your videos and take it away.
Hi, thank you, Trevor.
Hi.
Hi, Roz.
Hello.
So we're very pleased to have Roz Bernstein in conversation. She is, as you can see, an alum of NYU, having received both her MA and PhD here. She is also Professor Emerita in the Department of Journalism and Writing Professions at Baruch College at CUNY, where she taught journalism and creative writing classes from 1974 to 2016. In 2009, she wrote Boardwalk Stories, a collection of 14 fictional tales set from 1950 to 1970. And in 2010 was the co-author of Illegal Living, 80 Wooster Street and the Evolution of Soho, which she jointly wrote with the architect Shale Shapiro. Her most recent book is Engaging Art, Essays and Interviews from Around the Globe, a collection of some 60 of her online articles that she has written over the past about a decade, maybe
Correct.
a little less.
From the last decade.
Yeah, so since the 1980s, she's also been reporting from around the globe for such print publications as the New York Times, Newsday, The Village Voice, New York Magazine, and Columbia Journalism Review. She has also reported for our various online publications, including Medium, Tablet, Huffington Post, and Guernica, focusing primarily on cultural reporting and contemporary art with in-depth interviews with artists, curators, and gallerists. So as Trevor noted, please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A tab during the conversation. First, Roz and I will talk, and then we're hoping to open it up to questions from the audience. So as Trevor indicated, I'm the director of the Gray Art Gallery, which of course is NYU's museum. And I'm coming to you virtually from the gallery of one of the main gallery of the Gray's last show, Taking Shape, Abstraction from the Arab World, from the 1950s to 80s. If you want to know more about that show and or our past shows, feel free to go to the Gray's website. We're adding more and more content online on a daily basis. We had to close, of course, the show in mid-March due to COVID-19. However, I want to note that we had planned to be closed anyway this academic year to initiate some infrastructure repairs. And on your screen, you're going to be seeing images on a loop. First, Roz's 2 books, and then works from images in the 4 shows that she reviewed and that are in Engaging Art. But before we start, I first, since we're co-sponsoring this with University Development and Alumni Affairs, Alumni Relations, sorry, how did you come to pursue your graduate work at NYU?
Well, actually, here's a secret not too well reported, but it's now going on the record. I first came to NYU to take a few missing pre-med courses after graduating Brandeis, where I was a political science, economics, and pre-med major. with a sort of a minor in English. I lived for a summer in the only room available, which was the room under the bell tower in Judson Church. And that was my first NYU experience. I took a few courses there. And during that year, although I subsequently was accepted to med school, I made the decision that I really wanted to do what I always wanted to do, which was to be a writer. So I went back to work. I actually became an editor, a junior editor at Esquire magazine, and then to graduate school and did my master's and PhD at NYU. I was living at the time, actually at 17th and 3rd, which is as far uptown as I've ever lived.
Yes, we used to say occasionally that you got nosebleeds if you went above 14th Street.
Yeah.
So you're a downtown girl.
I am.
Good. So now turning to engaging art, in the book, you mentioned that from 2009 to 2019, you spent a lot of time traveling and encountered a lot of art that had received little or no mainstream media or press coverage. At the same time, clearly there was a major shift in publishing and books, and that a lot more content went online. The downside of that, obviously, is that things can disappear or get lost, or URL addresses change. So I'm assuming that's the reason that you went and assembled all these essays for your book.
Well, actually it is. One day I went looking for, I had various print positions in addition to teaching. I was a contributing editor to Contemporanea International Art Magazine, which was a great magazine, print magazine. And I was the, what was the title? East Coast correspondent for a culture magazine called Buzzine. And when I went looking for this and that and the other thing, they were gone. Occasionally they were there, or if they were there in a shortened form, or the photos were missing. And as someone who grew up with a library, I thought, well, there's always a book. So the decision I made was to go through my pieces, which were basically close, it's amazing, close to 180 pieces written online in the decade.
Wow.
170 pieces written online. And I selected 60 with a, really had a battle with myself, what to put in and what to put out.
Well, I can tell you that it's very engaging, hence the title. And I like the idea that you're focusing on a number of themes. And in fact, you've categorized the essays or the articles into 5 sections. Section 1 is artists at work and the politics surrounding them. And then I've chosen 3 of them as my kind of what we should talk about, because obviously 60 are a lot. Section 3 is denizens of downtown culture in Soho and Lower Manhattan. And section 4, picturing politics, the art of photography. I also like very much the fact that you dedicate the book to, quote, young artists working in today's politicized world. Right. So this is a shout out to our NYU students at Steinhardt and Tisch. These are indeed very challenging and very politicized times. And you've done a wonderful job, Roz, of pointing out and indicating how some artists manage to make their way during these turbulent and very disconcerting times.
Yeah. Well, when I looked at I put all the names of the stories I selected on little cards, and when I juggled them, everywhere there was one word that kept coming up: politics. So it was clear to me that I had gravitated to that, whatever I was covering, and I needed to write about it too.
So, you know, as I said, I've chosen just focusing on 4 articles that you wrote. They all happen to be on shows that were at the Gray, which is a nice, nice link for us, because I remember, and when I remember your stories, I remember talking to you. It was always great that you did very in-depth research on the articles that you wrote. And I would often talk with the curators. And so that was, I think, very refreshing and engaging from this side of the equation. But before we talk about inventing downtown, there's an image on the screen now. I just wanted to mention your book, and there's an image of it at the beginning, Illegal Living, 80 Wooster Street and the Evolution of Soho. I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's so engaging. It's the portrait of one building, and its evolution. So it's a history of a building and an unusual and fantastic story of how Soho is developed, how Soho comes to be. And in particular, as I said, it's focused on 80 Wooster Street, as the title indicates, and it's a building that George Maciunas, a unusual and quirky and unconventional artist, purchases in 1967, and it's the first artist cooperative in Soho. So it's a little bit after, it's very much after the show, Inventing Downtown, ends in 1965, but the next chapter clearly is Fluxus and the development of Soho. One of the things that I found interesting, and this is where, it's a small world for those of us who've been in the art world long enough. I was intrigued to read that one of the first residents one of the first artists to purchase a cooperative space was Marshall Westberg.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and Marshall actually was worked by Marshall and his alter ego, Ray Rodriguez, was in one of the first shows I did for the New Museum in 1981.
Well, here's a little secret. I had a work of Marshall's hanging on one of my loft walls, and it was his mustache on one of these group photos of men. And I stared at it for about 10 years, and it inspired me to collect group photos of women.
Yes, interesting.
A sort of antidote to the macho.
Yes. And then, Shale, is it pronounced Shale?
Shale, yeah.
Shale Shapiro was your co-author. He's also an architect, so he had a great deal of experience. He was also one of the first residents. And then again, what's great is that his papers are now at Fales Library.
That's correct.
And this is, go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah.
Please.
No, I was just going to say Shale was involved, not only an early resident, but Shale was involved in the 1971 zoning. So he played a major role in the creation of Soho, the founding of Soho.
And making illegal living legal.
Yeah.
So his papers are part of the amazing Downtown collection, which is part of NYU's special collections. And one of the things that I also learned in reading Illegal Living is that he had very direct connection to both Yoko Ono and John Lennon.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
When I met Shale, just to say, I was widowed, and this is second marriage, now 30 years plus. But when I met Shale, we were all talking about our children and whatever, and finally we talked about our John Lennon association. So he had worked for a year as a kind of art gopher for John and Yoko, doing exhibits. He even went up to the Everson Museum and he worked on some of their art. He worked about finding properties for them. He did art things. And my first husband was an editor at Business Week magazine who had interviewed John Lennon. So I had a drawing done by John Lennon, and he had his whole assortment of John and Yoko things too. So we have a John and Yoko collection between us.
Yeah, it's great. I just find it so interesting how things overlap and interconnect in the most unexpected ways. And then another kind of overlap was, I think the first time I visited, it might have been the second, I'm not sure, or third, but one memory that's really clear to me about 80 Wooster Street is visiting Krishna and Judy Reddy.
Right.
So Krishna Reddy, for those who don't know, was a professor at NYU for many years and taught printmaking. He's also in the Abbey Weed Gray collection of modern Asian and Middle Eastern art.
Yeah, and their loft, it was always wonderful to give a tour of it because their loft had been redone when they bought the building. And Judy used to say, Krishna's wife Judy used to say that it was the perfect example of a vintage 70s loft, that they hadn't changed a thing since that. But it was, he had a beautiful studio there. He was a great artist.
Yes, a very, very wonderful, wonderful artist. And I think a revered professor at NYU, and we're really pleased that his print program has been restarted now by colleague Noah Anderson. So he's really building on Krishna's legacy.
That's great.
So when you saw the slides that first appeared in terms of inventing downtown, it was this wonderful photograph of red grooms transporting work to the Rubin Gallery. And I just want to note that Melissa Radcliffe was the curator for that show. And what did you take away from the show? Do you have any memories in particular?
Oh, I do. Well, first of all, I knew Red Grooms and I knew Mimi Gross because their daughter Saskia was in the Education Alliance with my children, so that we had this association, and my husband Shale knew them as well separately. So there were, I love that exhibit. First of all, what I think is really remarkable about that exhibit, but the other exhibits and what why I was drawn to write about Gray, is that Gray does contextualize exhibits. It does history, rich historical bits. It brings in downtown papers so that you get more, it treats archival material as art. So I, as someone who sees myself as a cultural journalist and not only a critic, and as someone who has a PhD, I love the history, I love research, I love the papers from the galleries. I mean, if I recollect, there was the bylaws of, was it the Hansa Gallery, the bylaws which told you how much each artist had to pay dues and how many hours a week or month, or I should say month, they had to work. That's the kind of enrichment that you don't get at many galleries. You do get it at the Gray. And so throughout that exhibit, I felt there was rich detail on the individual galleries. The City Gallery, where I knew some of the artists. In fact, one of the artists lived in my co-op building, Sal Romano. So there were lots of Brada Gallery, and there were lots of, it resonated with me. It was before I came to Soho, but it sort of filled in the blank. It filled in that period before. And it really made me understand the meaning of downtown. I mean, I think Melissa did a brilliant job. The catalog is brilliant, and the exhibit was equally so.
Yes, it was a project dear to all our hearts, and about 6 years of work. And you know how long it takes to go through all that and assemble it and, you know, see it through. So no, Melissa did a heroic job, especially since she consulted so many of the artists' original papers and dug into it. And none of us, I don't think, before the show really understood how important these artist cooperatives were in Lower Manhattan, on 9th Street, on 10th Street, primarily 10th Street, and how that, you know, and eventually led to Soho. But it's so funny that George Machunas started the artist cooperative in terms of a living and work situation.
Well, I always found that very interesting when I saw the Inventing Downtown show with the co-ops, because George Machunas did have in mind a grander scheme that he eventually achieved. He achieved these flux houses, these artist co-ops, but originally they were going to have print studios, photography studios. They were going to have, each building was really going to be a full co-op. But it didn't work out that way. But George said in his notes, that he had imbibed deeply in his native Lithuania, the co-op movement there was a farmers co-op movement. And so when I saw Inventing Downtown with the co-op efforts of artists, it did really make a direct link in many ways to George, who came along and wanted to share food, different color foods, and wanted to have people share facilities. Didn't quite happen that way, but.
No, it's, these ideals are very rarely realized. And it's such, and this is, I think, also one interest that we share, is, and again, you mentioned it very, very clearly, the politics. And what is what you can realize, what one individual can do, and then how it quickly can get embroiled in bureaucracy and legalities, and it can often not come out the way exactly that you would expect.
George, he just thought he was going to co-opt these buildings, bring in artists, many of whom he met at Judson. He actually, when I was researching illegal living, I actually went to the hot, not educated, air-conditioned offices of the Village Voice because they were not digitized. I read through the ads in the Village Voice to find, because I only knew his phone number, to find what he was advertising, which building and what. And he was just bringing in people, and he didn't care about the legal thing. He just had in mind a dream.
Yes, and there were some artists who managed to stay the course and live in these several buildings that he was able to realize. And do you remember any of the figures? I mean, to buy a loft, it was $5,000.
Yeah, with improvements, it was 10, and the improvements consisted of, he had bought all this hexagonal bathroom. Every artist I interviewed said, oh, remember those bathroom tiles? And everybody had, only a few bathrooms still have it. I think they're almost all gone now. But he would give them improvements, which might go for another 5,000, so maybe up to 10,000, 5 or 10,000. He bought 80 Worcester, he bought the building for $105,000, but that was, a lot of money. And then he got into trouble because ultimately there were 16 flux houses, 16 buildings, but he would basically take the money from one building and move it over the next. And George, who was trained as an architect, actually did these meticulous charts and grids showing where all the money went. But in fact, it was just, he was totally honest, but it was going from one building to fund the next.
He was stealing from Peter to pay Paul, but it never his pocket.
Just pocket, not at all. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and this is something also I had meant to mention earlier. Another, again, link with NYU is that George had actually studied at the Institute of Fine Arts.
Yes.
And I think he got his MA in art history, didn't he? Did he finish or did he not? He didn't finish his master's thesis.
I don't think so. And he was at Carnegie Mellon. Okay, and I don't think he finished. No, and he took courses at the New School, but I don't think he finished the MA. No.
Yeah. But another interesting, fascinating overlap again of how everything is connected, or it's only 6 degrees of separation or less.
Right.
So the next show, which is good that the slide is up now, that I wanted to focus on was Toxic Beauty. Yeah, so this is from your section on artists at work and politics. Toxic Beauty, the art of Frank Moore. Again, you do your homework in rereading your article on Toxic Beauty. I was reminded that you talked to both me and Susan Harris, who was the co-curator of the show. Mm-hmm. And what I appreciate also is you have a really good understanding of how the reality behind doing exhibitions, and that, you talk about how the show itself was, took place, that it evolved from a working checklist that Klaus Curtis had originally done, that Michael Boudreau and David Lieber from the Gesso Foundation, which was the foundation after Frank Moore's death, came to us and said, Frank is a really important downtown artist and deserves more recognition. What are your memories about that show?
Well, one thing I wanted to say about that is what I've always been interested in about that show and others is that, yes, I'm interested in the process the curatorial process. And I'm interested in how you had to adjust to the space Gray has. So if it was a traveling show, you know, and it was a different shape space, you would go to get more photos with Allen Ginsberg. I remember that show, you got more photos added to it. And the Frank Moore exhibit, I thought, first of all, it was hung beautifully. And I thought what was really great is the materials you got from his archives, which you brought in, which were really, it wasn't just that it's not just that they fill it out, they alter one's understanding of the art. You know, some people see archival material like that as supplemental, and I actually see it as a kind of another form of art. I've had a talk with Marvin Taylor, who started the Downtown Collection, about this one time, and it gives the archival material a kind of agency that I think is very important, and your exhibit shows that. So they were just magnificent. I have a few favorites. I mean, I really love the Lullaby painting, was I think from 1997. I'm not, but I love the frames. I love our understanding of his love of nature, which we learned from your exhibit. So that it's not, you know, it's such a tension in his work between the toxicity of the AIDS drug, the disease he was dealing with, the epidemic that was afflicting his generation, and his passionate love for nature and these elaborate frames. It was really truly a remarkable show, and you managed to install it that way.
Well, thank you. You know, one of the things that I love most about my job is that I'm always on this amazing learning curve, and that I had not really been aware of Frank's work previous to this. And it, you know, I remember when Michael Boudreau dropped off this big book, then just these, as you said, very compelling, luscious, realist images, or kind of magic surrealism. I mean, he was an amazing painter. He really knew his craft. And you're right, his papers indicate how broad his interests were and how he delved into them again in great depth.
Well, also, sorry, go ahead, please.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that we were really pleased again that his papers were in Vail's library, and that we worked with Marvin and presented part of the exhibition there.
That's what I was going to add. Sorry, I jumped in. But I loved over at the, what's it?
Tracy Berry Gallery.
Tracy Berry. I love the beehive storyboards over there. I mean, that's what I mean. To see things, his canvases are huge, but you were able to see on a microscopic level how his mind worked, how he created. And I think that's a extraordinary combination, to get the macroscopic and the microscopic, to get you do it on so many of your exhibits. I don't like Charlotte Moorman, okay, is another one you do it on. So I really love when you dig into the little details of a person's life.
Yeah, no, we had, I think, excerpts from his yearbook in Roslyn, New York. You know, yep. All of the research he did, and you know, he in terms of the politics side of it, as you mentioned, he certainly was one of the first artists, I think, to really address AIDS very specifically, along with the downside of trying to treat AIDS, the toxicity of the cure itself. But what's so interesting also is that he was so far ahead of his time in terms of conservation and the environment and GMOs. I remember that huge painting he did about Niagara Falls and pure water. Yeah. So those of you who don't know Frank's work and are seeing it in these few images that we've compiled, he himself made the frames. Those were very essential. And he would work with a number of different colleagues to construct these really spectacular and very intricate frames that were definitely part and parcel of the artwork itself.
Yeah.
One of the things too, I just want to shout out to, again, Susan Harris, the co-curator for that show. I think for us as a university museum, it's also really, really important to be able to do the research through primary documents and primary sources. And so she did a deep dive into, like you did the deep dive into the Village Voice papers in terms of finding out where are those ads and how many times did they appear. She did the same into Frank's papers. And he was one of these, again, artists who saved everything. And just, you know, every scrap of paper, every receipt, all his research materials as he was working on some of these big history type paintings, you know, which he's telling these monumental stories. And so it was a wonderful show to work on. And like you, I'm a total fan of Beehive. Both the video and the preparatory storyboards. For me, it's really one of the most important video works of the century. And for those, again, who haven't seen it, hopefully you can go back to our website and take a deeper dive yourself.
Right.
We're putting on more and more images from our installations, but it's a
great.
wonderful story that's really about performance art, in that Frank wrote the story, but he worked with different dancers. He turned his loft into a giant set, which is pretty incredible. And these dancers, it's a whole story about a beehive, and, you know, it's totally compelling and totally remarkable. And he did get a Bessie for it. So, you know, it has been recognized.
Yeah.
Any other comments about Frank, or any other memories?
I was just going to say one thing, that, you know, sometimes it's painful because, you know, he used the AIDS drugs in the frames, but there are some of his works. There's one work that was in the show, which with this ring, which was one of my favorites, because he's also mystical. You know, he's environmental, he's talking about the toxicity of AIDS drug, but there's a whole mystical quality to his work that's just marvelous.
Yes, there is. And I think we were very happy when we came up with the title of Toxic Beauty, because there's such a beautiful component to his work. And yet the closer you look, then you see the horrors and some of the, you know, the unpleasant aspects that one doesn't necessarily want to acknowledge or feel comfortable too much with. So it was a delicate balance with that show in particular. So going on to the next show that, and you mentioned this one already, is the Allen Ginsberg show. So for both Inventing Downtown and for Toxic Beauty, these were shows that the Gray Art Gallery originated. Both were actually both involved a lot Thales Library. And, you know, again, the wonderful and marvelous aspect about being NYU is that we have these amazing special collections, and we have colleagues who are so knowledgeable. And so we both included, you know, again, these materials, and it's a way to get audiences who are sometimes interested in history and want to know the behind the scenes. They get a chance to see those as well. With the Allen Ginsberg show, which was titled The Photography of Allen Ginsberg, Best Minds of a Generation, captured on a $13 Kodak Retina. That's the title, sorry, of your article, Roz.
Right. Yours was Beat Memories, yeah.
Beat Memories, right, yeah. Thank you. This came from the National Gallery. And, you know, for us, it was a particularly interesting show to host because a lot of the images were taken in and around Lower Manhattan, and particularly Greenwich Village. So, Roz, you mentioned in it that you actually heard Allen Ginsberg perform.
I did. Well, he was of my generation. Village was live with poets and readers, and he was a great reader. I mean, he really, his voice, well, his work was great, but his voice was just beautiful. And the whole village was filled with poetry and coffee shops and guitars and drugs and rock and roll. And he was really, I think your exhibit, what I thought about so much is that I had not personally seen his photography. I'd seen a little, but not much. I had seen some of the snapshots in a couple articles. So it was really something for me to see. I knew all the players. I knew Corso, I knew Orlovsky, I knew all the people, William Burroughs. But what I loved, and this is sort of this was the writer in me, not just a writer about art. I loved the fact that on these big photos that had room for I call them more than captions, inscriptions is what I'd call them. Ginsberg worked as a copy editor, New York Telegram, and I think in other places as well. And so if you look at the inscriptions on those photos, the grammar, the diction is perfect. The punctuation is perfect. He underlines things that were meant to be italicized. He uses this, modern, whatever style book. You can tell what style book he's using. Maybe these were just funny little things that someone who has a PhD in English would notice, but there was something wonderful about it that you could feel the poet who also worked as a copy editor, but then the inscriptions themselves were not just, this is what's in the photo. He was a writer. So they went beyond it. They told you what was going on. They told you who was taking the photo, who was in the photo, who was living with whom, who was sleeping with whom at the time. So it's really a marvelous exhibit.
No, we were really pleased when we were offered. And again, the backstory is so interesting. So a little bit of the backstory is that Allen Ginsberg papers, alas, did not come to NYU this time. They came to our uptown rival, Columbia. Yes. And the archivist who was going through found all these negatives and found some of the photos. And he wanted to know who these people were. And he asked Allen to identify them. And so I think, if I remember correctly, it was Robert Frank and Bernice Abbott who encouraged him to reprint them in a larger size than they had been originally, and then to comment on them, as you say. And in a sense, this is this wonderful synergy of of where writing and visual imagery is brought together in a really direct means.
And a couple of them, most of them were of fellow poets and life in San Francisco and traveling and looking out his window. That we just saw that one on the screen. But there are actually a couple, if I recollect. There's one of his grandmother and one of his, I think, Uncle Max. And it's such a poignant inscription because I saw him a week before he died, and he mouthed the words. He could barely swallow. He couldn't sip from a straw, but he mouthed the words to me as I came in, "I love you." So it's really a remarkable writer writing those inscriptions.
And then, as you mentioned earlier, this is where the gray is this challenging in one way. Is we're small, but sometimes the shows are even smaller. And in this case, there weren't enough photographs. So we were able to go back and work with Howard Greenberg Gallery and choose some additional photos, some which didn't have the inscriptions, as you call them, but that filled out the picture, because he did have a remarkable visual sense and a sensibility, and that he captured, on these inexpensive cameras.
He shifted, I think, later to a Leica after whatever. But if I recollect, in your exhibit, you had an original handwritten manuscript for his poem Kaddish, which was a poem to his mother Naomi, which is fantastic, remarkable poem. I love when you bring in manuscripts. I love when you do that in the vitrines. I think it's not only because you are housed at NYU and you are a teaching gallery, it's a larger vision of what an art exhibit should be. And I think really you're to be commended for that.
Yeah, it's fun. It enriches, as you said, on so many levels. And our philosophy here at the Gray, where we talk endlessly about the labels and how much information we should provide. And we discuss that a long time to figure out, you know, we don't want to overwhelm the viewer, but our view is that those who don't want to read don't need to read. You know, they can skip going through all the documents, but those who do have the ability then to take that deep dive with us and check out and learn more. And the Howell manuscript, I'm sorry, the Kaddish manuscript was, you know, who knew? We had no idea. And this is where we really like working with graduate students and undergraduates as well, you know, sending them over. What can you find out? You know, what do we have? And we had some first editions of books, and the books themselves were great to see. So, you know, it's our mission, again, as a university museum, as a kind of laboratory to expand and redefine and figure out, you know, how we can create innovative exhibitions. So we're going to talk about one more show that we've had here, the Left Front, Radical Art of the Red Decade. But I want to encourage the people who are watching to again submit questions. And if you have any, right now I don't see any questions. So feel free to ask anything that you want to know for both me and Roz, and we'll be, you know, happy to answer. So the Left Front, again, why don't you start out about, you know, I really enjoy in your article that you often make reference to how you personally got intrigued by things. And you noticed that you mentioned at the beginning of this article that you had first read The Worker, the communist magazine, in a friend's basement when you were in high school. Do you want to talk a little bit about your upbringing?
Sure. So although I was born in Brooklyn, I, as a very young child, maybe kindergarten or first grade, moved to Long Beach, New York. And as it turned out, in Long Beach, which was a kind of a beach town, largely middle-class suburb of New York City, but there were people, I'll let be nameless, some of whom had taught in City University, City College, and had been kind of forced out during the Red Scare and the Red Baiting and the McCarthy period. And so, as life would have it, we found each other, some of these people, and sometimes I would find great reading material in their basement rooms. So that's where I first discovered some of these left things. And also, occasionally when I would come to New York City and go through Union Square, and I'd pick up discarded leaflets from people who had been soapbox. So that was another thing. And then I became interested in it, and I used to come to the city and take the subway up to the Thalia on the west side and see, you know, 10 Days That Shook the World and some of these. So I was trying to educate myself about these things. And then, as luck would have it, when I was an undergraduate at Brandeis, I studied with Herbert Marcuse. So it sort of led me to your exhibit.
Yes, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this exhibition had been organized by the Block Museum at Northwestern University. And this was a show clearly coming from another institution, and we enlarged it for our space with added materials from two other resources at NYU Special Collections, the Tamament Library and the Robert Wagner Labor Archives.
Right.
And that was fun as well. And what we loved about the show was that once again, it tied very directly to where we're located. And again, for those of you who don't know the Gray, as well as Roz, we really have, kind of two areas of focus. One is downtown New York, Lower Manhattan, in all of its various permutations. And then the other is, again, modern Middle Eastern and Asian art, which we got from Abby Weed Gray, who is our founder and who established the Gray Art Gallery in 1975. And so, it's nice to have these areas, and we're rich in both collections. And you saw some of works. I think we had the Alex Katz Ada Ada up, which is one of our works from the NYU Art Collection, which was started in 1958, which is one of our treasures. And what really appealed to us both about the show as well was the fact that it was curated by two graduate students at Northwestern, recently minted PhDs, who had done deep dive into the blocks holding of prints.
So that was, continue, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, just that was, so illuminating for them to also kind of, research further about the John Reed art clubs and, what was going on and how the artists were responding in the 30s to, once again, very turbulent times.
I spoke to both of them. That is true what you said about my liking to speak to people. I like to dig in because you get so much more. I mean, I can read their essays, and I do read their essays, but somehow talking to people, things happen. And that's sort of the way I like to do my reporting. I was struck by your exhibit because I particularly liked the way you had the John Reed clubs and the American Artists Congress, the two manifestos of it. It's really, it's a fine balance to be teaching people without being pedantic. And I think you accomplished that in this show. That's tricky. I've spent enough years in the academy to know how tricky that is. And so the way it was organized, I really thought the way you had a section on Scottsboro, the way you had a section on, what was the section on the Biro Bid?
Yes, that collective in Russia.
In Siberia. So the art was compelling, but the history interwoven in it illuminated the art. And that was pretty tricky in that exhibit.
Yeah, and a lot of credit is due to the curators that when sourcing these images and, figuring out, it's always a challenge. I'm in the middle working with my colleague, Deborah Balkan, working on a show about Americans in post-war Paris. There's never been a show focused on artists who moved to Paris on the GI Bill and spent time there immediately after the war. We know a lot about artists going to Paris in the 19th century and between the wars, and Hemingway and so forth. So one of the challenges is that there's over 400 who went to Paris on just the GI Bill alone. Wow. And so, how do you choose? How do you focus? And it's coming up with these thematics, and it's very much like writing, right? There's a wealth of information. How do you organize it? How do you think about it? How do you weave your own interpretation or story about it?
Well, it's always painful leaving things out, but what you're really doing is putting things in. You're making sure that you include the things. I used to teach philosophy of writing to my students, which is to make sure that they left gold coins. It's called the gold coin theory. Just, as they move through a story, sort of hints to the reader where they're headed. And I think it's true in an exhibit too. You need to be leading your reader around the gallery.
Okay, good. Well, I do have a question from somebody in the audience. How did your time as a pre-med student inform your understanding and interpretation of the Frank Moore exhibition, which was steeped in medical symbols and paraphernalia?
Oh, that's a really good question. the truth of the matter is I've always been something of a little bit of a science nerd. When I read the New York Times or papers, I read the science and medicine stories first. I confess that, often before the art stories. So why? I've always been interested in science. I thought I was going to be a physicist when I was in high school before medicine. And yes, when I was at the Frank Moore exhibit, I was very interested in the actual pills he had, the syringes, the drugs, the descriptions. How did it influence? I think he transforms that material. It's not just that he's giving you a factual account of these are the drugs I took. He takes them and weaves them into his art. He makes them something else. So I saw it both from the medical point of view and the artistic. He fuses them. They're fused in his work. And sometimes it's very painful. I mean, sometimes it's truly painful, but I think I've done other stories. I did a story on seeing art in medical archives, which was a trip through Italy looking at medical archives. So I confess to you that I have a little weakness in this direction.
Yes, well, it comes through, and in a wonderful way, the best of both. So we have one last question. And this is from Lucy Oakley, who you know is our head of education and public programs. For many years, you brought your art journalism students from Baruch College to the Gray. How did you prepare them for the visit, if you did? And how did you help them engage with shows as deeply as possible during and after their visits?
It's a great question, Lucy, and I definitely prepared them. I'm not of the school of bringing in a class cold. I would come and see the exhibit first, okay? Usually a couple times, and take some notes and some photographs, and spend at least one or two sessions of, at least one session of the class talking about the exhibit, providing a context. I'd often give them a little historical assignment. So they would come in knowing, well, something, more than something. And then they had an assignment, which was they had to focus on an individual artwork. And that often meant that they had to do a narrative piece, and it was not a short form piece. It used to have to be about 1,000 words. And so I loved taking them. I would bring them there to the Gray all the time. I taught a course called The Arts in New York City, and that was my favorite course, and the Gray was my favorite place to visit.
Thank you. We were always pleased, of course, to have you. And, you know, we are always pleased to get NYU students and students across the boroughs to come and see the shows. They're, you know, it's great to get their feedback. And often, you know, we train our students to lead the tours. And often the conversations between peers was also really, really wonderful. So we're at the hour. I want to thank you so much for participating, and I encourage people to check out your website and to order your books, and hope you'll continue to keep writing.
Absolutely. Well, you know, Lynn and Roz, thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. It was really fascinating to hear about a lot of these. You know, I love the Gray Art Gallery. I love the exhibitions you guys put on. So just to hear about all the things that you've worked on over the years, and, you know, really all that context is just amazing. I think, you know, it makes the experience of art so much richer when you understand the history behind it, rather than just seeing the images themselves. So really appreciate that. So we'd like to invite everyone to stay connected with the NYU Alumni Association, the Gray Art Gallery, and Roslyn Bernstein on our websites and social media platforms, which are listed on this page. We also invite you to consider making a gift to the Gray Art Gallery or NYU by going to nyu.edu/giving. Your support of the arts and the university is essential and much appreciated. So with that, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful rest of your night. And thank you again, Lynn and Roz. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Trevor.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Trevor. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.